You see, everyone has made videos about beginner street photography tips, and that's all fine and dandy because I've pretty much made my fair share of those videos as well. But what I think a lot of beginners are looking for are not necessarily the gear setup or the focusing tips that we typically talk about. Rather, what I feel like a lot of street photographers are looking for is what to look out for while going out on the street to make street photography. And at the end of the day, what really matters is the actual act of making photographs. So, how do you even approach that? Well, you guys are in luck because in today's episode, I'm going to answer that to the best of my ability. Today, we're going to be talking about what to look for out on the streets as a beginner street photographer. And I actually have a lot to cover today, so be sure to stick till the very end. And if you are brand new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and drop a like for more street photography related videos. But with that said, let's jump right into it. So let me start off by saying every street photographer has a different style. It's the same thing as a chef. A chef is gonna be different than the next chef. And so even though I'm gonna be talking today about what to look for out on the street, this is not the end all be all. This is just my approach and what I have learned over the last 7 years being a street photographer. So it's important to understand this concept that everybody has different styles. And based off of the different styles that they go for, they tend to use different types of gear. And this leads us over into our first point, and that is if you are using a wider focal length, what do you even look for? Well, the answer is simple, folks. A wider focal length will give you a wider field of view, which essentially means it's going to capture a lot of information. So if you are using a wider focal length, like this 28mm here on my Leica M6, what I personally look for are scenes. Now, obviously this is pretty general. Scenes, what exactly does that mean? And the best way I could describe it is when you're out on the street and you're walking around looking for things to photograph, maybe you'll see some really pretty light. Or if you notice that there is a large gathering and people are doing a certain activity, let's say for example, like a street performer out on the street, or maybe you're just walking around and people are kissing, they're hugging, all of these crazy human emotions, you can gravitate to making photographs of scenes. And this doesn't necessarily mean you have to get up and close in their face at first. It could just mean taking a step back, making a photograph maybe 10 to 15 feet away and just documenting what you see. And in a lot of ways, this can create some really powerful photographs.
Notice how in these photographs, I am photographing from a distance. This is what I mean by photographing scenes rather than getting up close and personal to your subjects, which could be very daunting as a beginner street photographer.
And so on the flip side, this is going to lead us into point number 2. If you are using a more narrow focal length, such as a 50mm or an 85mm, you're going to be getting a lot more clean images, but they almost force the photographer to really look for smaller details. And more narrow focal lengths don't really capture tons of information, so you have to be very, very intentional with where you direct your lens to. Take, for example, this 56mm lens on my Fujifilm X Pro 2. This ends up being an 85mm equivalent. And when I shoot with a lens like this, the main thing that I look for are isolated subjects. This could mean very geometric light, or you notice a particular subject just by themselves and they have an interesting expression on their face, or there's a certain emotion that you're trying to evoke in your image. And if you can effectively look for small details, whether that be emotion, whether that be any type of movement, leading lines, beautiful composition, that's how you're gonna make powerful photographs with a long lens. Longer focal lengths are great if you just don't have that confidence yet, to go up to somebody and make a photograph. And a lot of times you're not even photographing people head on. It could be reflections. It could be from a very far distance, but you're utilizing what's in front of you as a composition.
So let's break this down a little bit more here. In this first photograph, you can see that there's a reflection through this kind of glass mirror. And the idea behind this is I'm using this mirror to kind of reflect some of the light from behind me and focus in on some of those smaller details. Remember, with a longer focal length, you're not really able to capture a wide angle field of view. And so you're going to need to really pinpoint certain things and be very intentional with how you utilize that in your frame. Now, the following images are also going to show different examples of how you can utilize a longer focal length to your advantage. But at the end of the day, it's really fun to just experiment and play around with whatever you feel is best.
But just based off of what I have learned over the last 7 years, what you look for out on the street purely depends on what you are interested in. And I want to talk about how to break that process down so that you can go out there and make some of the most powerful street photographs after this video. But before we jump into that, you guys, let me take a quick second to pay some bills and give a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which are the good folks over at Squarespace. Squarespace is your all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Now, I think the common misconception with photography websites is you need to be a portrait photographer or whatnot to, kind of have one. And that is simply not true. If you are a street photographer, you can create your own website today to better help present your work with your photography. Luckily, Squarespace makes it simple. They have award-winning templates you can use to get started within minutes. They even give you a dedicated page for a portfolio, a gallery, an e-commerce shop, and one of my newest favorite features, which is the appointment scheduling tab. This is great for anyone offering photography services. They can see what times you have available and then book you directly on your website, saving you the hassle of the back and forth email process that everyone knows is very tedious. So get started with your own professional website today by heading over to squarespace.com/kingjapes and entering promo code kingjapes at checkout to receive 10% off of your first purchase of a domain or a website. Huge thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. All right, so now that we are back, let's talk about what I truly feel like is the meat of this video, and that is what to actually look for out on the street. Now, there are a million things that you can search for online. You can read blogs, you can read workshops, you can, go to the greats even. And the one commonality between what everyone talks about when you look for things out on the street is to look for emotion.
While there is still no word on a cure for the virus, government officials report the virus is not airborne, but can be transferred through contact with blood.
Emotion is the most powerful thing in any photograph. It's why portrait photography like maternity shoots or, wedding photographs are very powerful. They're evoking that emotion of love between two people. The same reason why photojournalism, documenting, for example, like Steve McCurry's photographs and why they're so powerful, it's because they're evoking that pure emotion from war. And folks, it is no different when it comes to street photography. If you are trying to make photographs of things that typically don't really have emotion, in my opinion, they seem a little bland, like, you didn't really season the food enough. And so think of emotion as seasoning. You want to look for seasoning and good flavor out on the street. And this is very simple to look for. Think about all of the different emotions that you personally feel. When you're happy, you smile. When you're sad, you may droop your head down a little bit. All of these little basic human emotions are what we look for in street photography. Now remember these 3 key points, because this is technically what I look for when I'm out on the street. The first point here is story. What story am I trying to tell? Really what this means is, what emotion am I trying to portray in this image? Next up is direction. Is there any movement that helps kind of exaggerate that emotion? And last but not least, folks, is light. What type of light is my photograph taken in? Is it a sunny day? Because sun typically evokes more of a positive emotion, right? Sun gives us life. Or is it really dark? Is this gonna give me some type of really isolated, sad feeling to my photograph? Light plays a huge role in the feel of your photograph. And that's really what you want with making street photographs. You want someone to feel something. And that was a lot to take in. Story, direction, light, keeping that all in mind. And how are you supposed to think of all of that within a split second when you go out on the street? And the real kind of secret to this, folks, is my next point actually, and that is to be patient. And to be patient in not just waiting for a subject to walk through your frame so you can make a photograph. It also means being patient with yourself. What really matters is that you're training yourself and giving yourself the proper amount of time to kind of enjoy the process. For example, what I did was I like to focus on one particular aspect of those 3 points and look for that out on the street. So if I wanted to look for story, the first thing I'm gonna go look for is emotion. And I'll do this for however long I need to do it until I feel comfortable with, being able to recognize that emotion out on the street and photograph it. And then I'll move on to the next thing. Once I figure that out, I'll add back in the story, and then so on and so forth with light, right? So it really comes down to micro training. Micro train one individual skill and then continue building it as you go. And the last thing that we're going to be talking about here is something called street photography triggers. Essentially, photography triggers are just things that you are drawn to naturally. And this is really based off of the type of photography that you enjoy. So I noticed when I was getting started with street photography, I was really attracted to photographing suits, people in suits. And it all had to do with the type of photography that I was consuming at the time. I was consuming a lot of Robert Doisneau, Henri Cartier-Bresson, a lot of like Gary Winogrand, where they photographed in a time where in these bigger cities, people wore suits. Now here's my personal tip. Try to identify 3 main things that you like to see out on the street, whether that be, suits, pretty light, leading lines, anything really, and write those down. Once you have written those 3 down, go out with your camera and start making photographs of just those triggers. And the idea behind this is kind of getting yourself used to identifying things quickly out on the street. A lot of what street photography is, like we said earlier, is just being reactive. So if you can identify it and see that that is something you'd like to take a photo of, that is really the first step in making a good photograph, knowing what you can do with a certain subject. Now there is a huge downside to this process, and I really encourage you guys to listen to this one because it's very, very important. Looking for your photography triggers is not necessarily a bad thing, but what is a bad thing is closing your mind off to everything else around you that could potentially be a powerful photograph. For example, I had a project called Crosswalk where I was photographing specific moments in time where 2 people on each side of the street cross and interact on, their daily routine. During that time period, what I noticed is that I was completely ignoring everything else around me. So the beautiful light, downtown San Francisco, I wasn't capturing that. I was literally on a crosswalk. And essentially what you're doing with looking for photography triggers is putting a box around your ideas. And when you do that, you lose your optimism. So my next tip here, and my last and final tip, folks, is to be very optimistic about what to make photographs about. Just because you like photographing suits or just because you like photographing birds in the sky, don't make that the only thing you look for. And really this all comes down to art consumption. What type of photographs are you consuming, whether that be on Instagram or through photo books or videos, because those are directly going to influence what you like. And so this is why I always tell people, curate your Instagram. Follow people whose work that you really love so that you are reminded about what you like to see and what you may want to photograph in the future. As a beginner, I know there's a lot of things that are surface level, but you have to dig deeper. And this is really going to push your photography to the next level if you can learn how to identify your triggers, but also be optimistic at the possibilities around you. And remember, folks, you want to show how you see the world, how you interpret what's around you. And that's the beauty of street photography. It's all an interpretation and how you can utilize your camera and the positioning of the skills that you learned to tell a story and evoke emotion. That's gonna wrap it up for me, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Definitely drop a like down below and please hit that subscribe button. I noticed that I think it's like 60% of the viewers that watch my videos aren't even subscribed, which is crazy to me. So, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more street photography content. But that's gonna wrap it up for me. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you guys in the next one, as always.